Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Heather Edmonds with the National Aging and Disability Transportation Center. And I'd like to welcome you to our webinar on volunteer driver insurance. We have a wonderful presentation today, but first I'd like to go over a few logistics. Participants will be in listen-only mode during the presentation. The webinar is being recorded and will be sent via email along with slides. Closed captioning is available, and if you need that option, please go to the bottom of your screen, click the CC button, and that option will be available to you. Questions can be submitted via the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We will have a facilitated Q&A at the end of the presentation, but you can also submit your questions during the presentation. Right now, I'd like to turn it over to Virginia Dyes, our co-director for the National Aging and Disability Transportation Center, and she will introduce our speaker for today.
Wonderful. Thank you, Heather. Good afternoon, everybody. Very good to have you with us. We are excited about this webinar and the opportunity to share this great information with you. We're also hoping that we will have time at the end for some exchange of ideas and questions. And we will, at the end of the webinar, everyone who participated will receive an evaluation, which is standard for us. We always ask folks to please fill it out and give us your feedback. So with that, I'm going to move right ahead and introduce our speaker, Jana Limett. Jana is Senior Strategic Policy Advisor with AARP's Public Policy Institute. And she works in the Livable Communities team at AARP. She's a researcher, a writer, a videographer, a keynote speaker, and a great meeting planner. I can say that from personal experience from last year when we worked together to plan a meeting. She is going to be talking about a new AARP publication. But I want to say that Jana has expertise in a lot of different aspects of transportation. And if you've never heard her presentation on universal mobility as a service, I highly recommend it to you. If you go on the AARP website, you can access that. She's going to be talking this afternoon about the survey and report that AARP released recently on volunteer driver insurance in the age of ride hailing. So with that, it's my pleasure to turn it over to Jana.
All right, thank you so much, Virginia. And I have to send kudos your way. NADTC is just such a wonderful organization, does such important work, and we have always enjoyed collaborating with you all. And I also want to give a shout out for your photo gallery. You will find that there are many photos in this presentation in the paper itself that we've used. It really helps get the word out about this important issue, helps to humanize it, and is so important. So, as Virginia said, I will be talking about our new paper entitled Volunteer Driver Insurance in the Age of Ride Hailing. And this is something that we started thinking about as far back as 2015, when we began to hear an uptick in anecdotal reports from volunteer transportation program managers that their volunteers were having increasing issues with their insurance agents. And what we were hearing is that their agents were having more difficulty distinguishing them from ride-hailing drivers, those drivers that drive for Uber or Lyft, also known as transportation network companies. So we heard enough of this that we decided to look at this issue in more detail. And so this is really a paper that we worked on for more than a year, really probably close to 2 years of part-time research involving quite a number of different folks to look at different aspects of volunteer driver insurance. And this is the culmination of that. Now, 2015 really corresponds with the growth in ride-hailing. So Uber as a company was founded in 2009. It started providing service in San Francisco commercial service in 2010. And by 2015, the company had reached 1 billion rides worldwide. And Lyft was launched in I believe 2012 in San Francisco as well. So it was right around this time that we began to hear this uptick of concerns. Now that's not to say that insurance issues have not always been around, but we believe that Uber and Lyft exacerbated the problem. Now when Uber and Lyft were first launched, the companies did not provide insurance for their drivers, nor did they operate as commercial taxi operations under most state and local laws. And lots of drivers were not revealing to their insurance agents that they were driving as for hire and simply used their personal auto insurance. And this additional exposure made insurers very nervous. And we believe that is why there was so much concern and so many reports from volunteers during that time frame, and really continuing today. Now, eventually, the insurance industry caught up with TNC laws, and now many insurance companies have TNC policies that drivers can purchase. And in addition, Uber and Lyft now maintain a $1 million in liability insurance on behalf of drivers and delivery people once a ride is accepted. The driver is expected to obtain a TNC driver policy for the period when the app is on, but waiting for a ride request, and the driver's personal auto policy kicks in when offline or the driver app is off. Now, while insurance coverage for those driving for ride-hailing companies has largely been clarified in recent years, volunteers still have no such clarification. And that our sense is that issue continues to exist. In fact, a survey that was done, I believe, by Carrie Diamond's organization when she was with the Greater Wisconsin Agency on Aging, they surveyed all 60 volunteer transportation programs in the state and found that almost a third reported that one or more drivers had encountered insurance issues. So I mentioned our research was really multifaceted. We hired the Texas Transportation Institute to do a survey of state laws pertaining to volunteer insurance, liability, livery, and ride hailing. They also conducted many of the industry interviews. I then made cold calls to insurance agents at the 10 largest insurance companies by market share. And because those did not elicit very clear answers, AARP made a formal solicitation to CEOs for clarification. This is a list of the industry interviews that we had. Many volunteer transportation program managers, the volunteer insurance services of SEMA companies, and I believe William Henry will be speaking on a subsequent webinar and knows a ton of has a ton of information about this issue. The National Volunteer Transportation Center at CTAA, the Center for Insurance Policy and Research, Property Casualty Insurers Association of America, and also I spoke with several state insurance commissioners. The paper was reviewed by the Consumer Federation of America and Windles, Marks, Lane, and Mittendorf, LLP, which are attorneys who specialize in transportation regulation, tort, and insurance issues. I want to start with the findings from the survey of state laws and our correspondence with state insurance commissioners. So TTI, in surveying states, found that there are 15 states that have laws on the books related to insurance in volunteer drivers, but only 7 of those states actually prohibit insurance companies from denying or canceling insurance, imposing a surcharge, or increasing rates simply because the driver is a volunteer. We found 2 states that differentiate volunteer drivers from livery services. None of the TNC laws address volunteer drivers, except perhaps the state of Washington that says that a commercial services provider is not a private nonprofit transportation provider, which likely distinguishes volunteer drivers from ride-hailing drivers, but it's not completely clarified. And then TTI also found that there are 38 statutes that deal with civil liability for volunteers, but many fewer states that explicitly talk about volunteer drivers. Now, I mentioned that there are 7 states that prohibit denying or canceling insurance, imposing a surcharge, or increasing rates. And those states are Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Rhode Island, Maryland, Florida, and California. And most of those states, or largely those states, look to the Maine law that was passed back in 1996 that basically had those 3 elements in their statute to not prohibit our increases in rates and dropping insurance, etc. I should point out from Maine's law that the section of law does not prohibit an insurer from refusing to renew, impose a surcharge, or otherwise raise the rate for a motor vehicle liability insurance policy based upon factors other than the volunteer status of the insured driver. And this, I think, was very important clause to get, if not the support of the insurance industry, at least get the insurance industry to not oppose this form of legislation. I also, to see how well these laws were working, I did speak with insurance commissioners from several states and noted that in Maine, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island, all confirmed that if a volunteer brought an insurance problem to their attention, the law would be that in that volunteer's favor. So for instance, from New Hampshire, I quote, "To the extent that a New Hampshire personal lines automobile insurance policy contains such an exclusion, the exclusion is not enforceable by the insurer." And from Rhode Island, the law stands as it says, and volunteer drivers cannot be refused coverage. Now, I also spoke with insurance offices in other states without these laws, North Dakota and New York, for instance, and I was told that nothing in state law would prevent insurance companies from excluding volunteers in their personal auto policies, meaning they could be requested to get a commercial policy or they'd raise their rates, but they were not aware of any insurance companies that had done so. And as the chief actuary for the state of New Mexico said, the specific issue is not clearly addressed in rules or policy forms that we have seen in our review. And that is to say, state law similar to Maine's could be very helpful. Now, I wanted to take a short pause here, and in just a second, we'll go to a poll. And the question is going to be, should Good Samaritan laws extend to volunteer drivers? And for those who may not be familiar with the term Good Samaritan laws, they're essentially laws that says that if you as a volunteer take action in good faith and something bad happens, you cannot be held liable. So let's go to the poll and see what do people think about this. And I guess, Melissa or Heather, it's up to you how long to give people to answer the poll. Simple yes, no question.
Okay, we can end the polling.
Oh, wow. Okay. So 90% of you said that yes, Good Samaritan law should extend to volunteer drivers. So y'all can close that response window if it's covering your screen. And you all may be surprised to find that that is in conflict with AARP's policy. And the reason that is that Good Samaritan laws were written to protect individuals offering assistance in the event of an emergency, so that people are not afraid of offering assistance, such as CPR in the event of a heart attack. But volunteer drivers offer a consistent service for which there is time and ability to assess qualifications and do some kind of screening. And it's also in conflict with our policy because we support the right to redress for consumers, and consumers should have the right to accessible, appropriate, and adequate redress, including the full range of legal remedies. And the example that was given to me by folks who work on AARP's policy relative to consumer policy and insurance is that an example of, say, a volunteer driver gets into an accident and injures a pedestrian, that we want to make sure that that pedestrian is in a position where they have some recourse to go back and ask that insurance company for that volunteer driver to provide redress for any injuries that have happened. So we believe that provided drivers are insured, it gives others on the road that opportunity to have some protections as well. So moving on, I mentioned I made cold calls to insurance agents, and this is how they responded. So 6 out of 10 agents said that they would likely cover volunteer drivers under personal auto insurance policies, even if reimbursement is provided. But of these, 1 would charge a business use surcharge, another would list the vehicle as a commuter vehicle. So those were not as onerous type of policies as a commercial policy, but certainly the rates would slightly increase. Now, 2 insurance agents said that they would cover if no reimbursement for the driver was provided, as they equated that reimbursement with the driver being a for-hire driver needing a commercial policy. And 2 agents from 2 companies said that they would require a commercial policy even if no reimbursement was received. Now, in our calls to industry leaders, such as the Property Casualty Insurers Association of America or the Consumer Federation of America, they were actually quite surprised by both our hypothesis that this was a problem as well as what we were hearing from insurance agents. Because the way insurance works is that unless there's an explicit exclusion on a policy, then the activity should be covered. Now, we also were interested in understanding what happens if the nonprofit charges a fare or a fee to help offset some of the operating costs of the service. And only 1 agent we spoke with felt that it would be immaterial to the insurance company because the policy is a contract between the driver and the company. But it was murky for all the other agents. A couple of them said, kind of sounds like a rideshare, meaning Uber in this context. Now, we also felt that given how TNC insurance policies were written, as well as many of the policies in state law regarding transportation network companies, where they define rideshare or ride-hail as providing a prearranged transportation through an app or a fee, that given the increasing numbers of volunteer transportation programs that are now matching riders to drivers through an app similar to one that's used by Uber, as well as there's a, certainly I think maybe 1/3 of the volunteer transportation programs out there do charge a fee to the customer in order to access the service, that this could be problematic. Now, with all of these responses from agents themselves, we really didn't feel like we had a good handle on the situation for a publication. We're hearing from the insurance industry, well, it shouldn't be a problem. We're hearing from insurance agents answers that were very ambiguous and not giving us a lot of clarification. So AARP, toward the end of the research, decided to send out an official solicitation to the CEOs, the heads of general counsels, and the heads of human resources from the 10 largest insurance companies by market share, and in addition, the Hartford, who is an approved insurance provider and partner of AARP. And long and behold, we got responses from 9 insurance companies, and all of them unanimously said, very contrary to what many of their agents were saying, that their personal auto insurance policies would cover volunteer driving. And for all of those except Nationwide that didn't give us a clarification on it, they all said that the coverage would apply even if the driver receives reimbursement for expenses such as mileage, and if the coverage, if the nonprofit charges a fare for the service. So this is great news, and I would say that this is probably the most impactful piece of the research that we did, because now I believe that individual drivers, potential volunteers, program managers can take this research, and if they're getting pushback from their insurance agents, just say, hey, your company said in 2020 that this service would be covered under personal auto policies. What's changed? And I also think that it could be used with other insurance companies that we didn't reach out to in order to get some better clarification. But that doesn't mean that there's no problem, because volunteers deal directly with their insurance agents, not company CEOs. And so as long as agents are giving murky information, saying that their rates might increase, they might be dropped, they need a commercial policy, the problems of recruitment will continue. And that puts a real barrier to this important form of volunteerism. Furthermore, nonprofit program managers, as many of you will attest to, you really don't have time to go back and forth with insurance agents every time an issue arises. We need this issue resolved. So, in our hopes of helping to address this issue, we've put forward a set of three sets of recommendations: one for state legislators, one for the insurance industry, and a final for nonprofits themselves. So first, state legislators. Adopt Maine's law or a variation on that, basically stating that insurance companies are prohibited from denying or canceling insurance, imposing a surcharge, or increasing rates solely on the basis of serving as a volunteer driver. Also, state TNC laws and other sections of state statutes clearly need to define and distinguish among volunteer drivers, TNCs, and other for-hire service providers. And as an added bonus, it would be very nice that these laws clarify that those organizations that charge a passenger fare are also excluded from being considered as for-hire transportation under livery laws and other for-hire types of laws. Our recommendations for the insurance industry were that they also need to define and consistently apply terminology associated with TNCs and volunteer drivers, distinguish between those two, and they need to train their brokers and their insurance agents so there's not this level of confusion that's provided to their customers. Luckily, there is language already out there that insurance companies can use to clarify their policies. So this comes from the Insurance Services Office, ISO, which provides statistical and actuarial information to insurance companies. And they also write policy language that insurance companies can adopt and pull into their own policies. Specifically with respect to their TNC policies or ride-hailing policies that are exclusions to personal auto policies, they state that the ownership or operation of a vehicle while it is being used for volunteer or charitable purposes does not apply to that particular exclusion. Interestingly, none of the insurance agents that I spoke with, nor any of the insurance policies that I was able to acquire through the research, were we able to find indications of this language having been brought into those policies. So that's certainly an area for improvement. And I have some hope here. Since we had involved the insurance industry as part of those interviews early on, I've remained in touch with them, and I have a request from the Property Casualty Insurers Association of America to provide them with a one-pager summary oriented toward the insurance industry, one-pager of the paper that they will send out to their membership, which is a way that we can help to increase knowledge that this problem exists out there and hopefully get some traction in this regard. Now, with respect to recommendations for nonprofits, we essentially recommend what SEMA companies, the volunteer BSA, William Henry's group, who will be talking with you in another webinar, and that is to purchase excess automobile liability for volunteer drivers, establish routine safety protocols, and properly screen drivers and require them to complete a driver training course. I think these are good practices for nonprofits, but I also think that they will go a long way to helping us as we push to get laws passed in more states than just those 7. I think it will help diminish the possibility that the insurance industry may push back on laws of this nature, if they can see that we're all doing our part to try to minimize risk. So just to wrap up the presentation portion of the webinar, volunteer provided transportation provides a crucial role in supporting individuals, and insurance issues can pose significant barriers to recruitment, and it really does threaten the support system that so many older adults and others rely on to get around. My hope is that with this research, we now have some of the tools that we can use to get some state policy passed, that we can push the insurance industry to incorporate better language into their policies so that we can start to break down these difficult barriers that volunteer transportation programs are having. Just to point out, Virginia mentioned our website where you can find the paper. It can be a little bit difficult to find things if you just go to aarp.org. So the direct link is aarp.org, Future of Transportation. And there is where you can also find my work on Universal Mobility as a Service. We have a great video series on Flex Denmark, which I believe is the world's most coordinated and technologically sophisticated demand responsive transportation program. And we'll soon be coming out with a paper that really is an offshoot of an important roundtable that NADTC, the Transportation Research Board, and AARP had last year around this time on modernizing demand responsive transportation. So look out for that. So with that, I'll turn it back to NADTC, and I think we'll go to Q&A.
Great. Jana, thank you very much. This is the second time I've heard a version of this presentation, and I have to say that both times I found it extremely provoking and interesting, and very relevant to the work that I think we're all engaged in. There are a couple of questions that we've got in the chat, so let me take them kind of one by one. There was a question about the mobility as a service presentation, and we'll be sure when we send the PowerPoint to also ensure that you have the links to that particular presentation as well as to the report. When we sent out the registration for the webinar, we also included a link to the report itself, which should have worked, but if you have had any difficulty, we certainly want to know that. There was also a question about the follow-up webinar. We have not set a date. I can tell you that it will be after Thanksgiving, and it will include a presentation by William Henry with SEMA, the volunteer insurance service that he is expert at. And that really is about the whole issue of liability insurance for volunteer transportation programs. So stay tuned. We will post that on our website and also in the NADTC eDues. So there was somebody, Cheryl Jewell, who asked specifically about New York State. And I don't know if you have any specific information that you can share with Cheryl or not.
Sure. But before I do that, I just want to point out the information I presented today is the most up to date. But the paper, probably by the end of next week, we have another version coming out, because since we released this, we got responses from 2 more insurance companies, Farmers and USAA, who have now also added their voice to, yes, we will cover volunteers. So that's good news. And we're going to continue to encourage insurance companies to provide that feedback. And we are more than happy to get the word out, because I think it helps all of you out there if you can show that table and say, yeah, you cover us. It gives a lot of comfort to your volunteers. With respect to New York, it was one of the states I was able to interview, at least staff at the Insurance Commission's office. And that was a state that does not have a law that would preclude insurance companies from raising rates, et cetera. The individual I spoke with really kind of scratched his head. He was another one of the individuals from the insurance industry. Is like, this isn't a problem. This shouldn't be a problem. This is kind of surprising. And he also said that he believed that New York, that most of the insurance companies that operated in New York would use ISO forms, but we really didn't have an opportunity to access those policy forms to verify whether that language was in there or not. So I don't have any further information from that. I think New York is still one of those states where there could be problems, but with most insurance company heads coming in and saying that they're going to cover volunteer drivers, I think that's the comfort that we're able to give volunteers at this point in time.
Okay. We've got a couple of comments related to Good Samaritan laws, and I'm going to read one particular comment, Jana. So the Good Samaritan law excluded volunteer drivers as it was assumed their personal, and I'm assuming this particular attendee is talking about their own state, because it excluded volunteer drivers as it was assumed their personal vehicle insurance would cover them. As you've pointed out, this is not always the case, so that's why the Good Samaritan law becomes important. Some insurance companies are more willing to change the Good Samaritan law versus the liability insurance. So I don't know if you have any additional comment about that. I know that many, many years ago, and I have not seen an updated version of this, the National Conference of State Legislators, I believe, did a survey of Good Samaritan laws and identified, at that point, I think there were 4 states where the Good Samaritan law specifically addressed the needs of volunteer drivers. Tennessee is one of those states. Oregon is another. Maine may be one, but quite honestly, I don't remember the other states that were identified in that. So is there anything else you'd like to share relative to Good Samaritan laws? And there was a specific question as to, from the AARP perspective, where is the protection for the volunteer driver program if the Good Samaritan law is not changed?
So I should point out that one of our appendices of the paper does do an update of the NCSL research that was done. And so you can actually go there and see which states do have these laws on the books and the number of states. I don't recall off the top of my head. I'd have to look that up. The individual who's writing in with the question, I think it's a really good, because there are states out there that don't require auto insurance, and I believe, I'm not an insurance expert in all of these areas, and so that does raise a good question. And I think that might be a really excellent question for William Henry, who's much more expert in insurance. But my guess is that If I was a nonprofit, I would be reluctant to have an individual driving for me that didn't have some auto insurance. And I think a lot of people, even though they're not required to have the insurance, are still going to get a personal auto insurance policy. Don't know if there's anything else that I can say to that. But again, I do think William Henry would have some good information.
Thanks. We'll be sure to bring that to his attention. And thanks for pointing out that your appendix updates that information.
Yeah, you know, another thing that I should just maybe state a little more clearly is I think we have to be concerned about all of the road users, risk and liability. So it's not just volunteer drivers, but also what about the pedestrian that they may hit who may not have health insurance in order to cover their injuries in the event of a crash. And that's why insurance is so important. You know, we could have a very long philosophical conversation about why we need health insurance for every member of our country, as well as why it's probably a good idea for states to have laws saying you've got to have auto insurance as well. But
absolutely, and I'd say from the perspective of programs, volunteer transportation programs, that it is well within their, if they want to protect their program and have that program continue, insisting that there be some sort of process for ensuring that their drivers have adequate insurance coverage, I think is very important. I mean, we know that from the field, there have been only a few incidents of volunteer driver programs where there have been serious accidents or where there's been a threat of a lawsuit. We know it isn't a huge problem that has run through the provision of volunteer transportation, but we also know that concerns about liability and insurance are things that cause communities to hesitate to create volunteer driver programs. And I think that over time, they have proven their great value in the communities where they operate, and they're really needed in a lot more communities. So anything that we can do to make that easier is something that we should all be concerned about.
And I would just add that I think these programs have proven their worth during COVID as they've pivoted to providing delivery of goods to many older adults and people with disabilities to their homes.
Right.
So yeah, we need these programs, and we don't need insurance to be the barrier to recruiting volunteers.
Right. I'm just going to ask this question the way it's asked. So are fees and copays the same thing? And I'm not really sure what the context is for that, but you want to take that, Jana?
So I referred to both fares and fees as kind of the same general thing. It's where the nonprofit, I know ITN America does this, where they will charge a fare for the customer who receives the ride. It's a fairly nominal fare, but it goes to help offset the cost of operating the program. Other nonprofits may charge an annual fee to access the service, but may have an unlimited number of rides that they can request, or a certain number of rides each month, et cetera. So there are different ways that nonprofits try to recoup some of those operating costs if they're not otherwise covered by foundation funding, government funding, et cetera.
And I think the copay might come into play when if somebody has a Medicare Advantage plan, for example, and they provide transportation, or the volunteer transportation program has been certified as a Medicaid provider in the community, there may be copays that come up. So that's the term, I think, that's usually used in relation to health insurance.
Yeah, and I don't know a lot about that. That is, you know, very interesting, and I'd be interested to learn more.
Yeah,
how
I think
that all works.
That's an area that we all want to know more about because, as I understand it, there are a lot more Medicare Advantage plans that are offering transportation. I don't know if any of them are thinking about volunteer programs, but it seems to me that that's another avenue. So there's a question from Tuck Duncan, who says, do you have a template for the legislation? And I guess he's talking about the main legislation that you cited. I'm not quite sure if he's talking about volunteer, the Good Samaritan law, but probably it has to do with the legislation for protecting drivers.
Yeah, I would assume that's the case, and I can get the statute citation that he could look up and get the full language.
Wonderful, Janet. And once you get that, if you could send that to us, then we will include that in follow-up information. And so what are the names of the 9 to 10 companies whose CEOs said they would cover their insurance clients? And I believe those are listed in your report and will be listed in your follow-up report or your updated report.
Yeah, they're Appendix A of the paper, but I'll just read them off quickly since there aren't too many. It's Allstate, American Family, Farmers, Hartford, Nationwide, Progressive, State Farm, Travelers, and USAA.
And here's a tough question. Should volunteers make their insurance companies aware that they transport people through this volunteer program?
So I think that is such a wonderful question. I got this at a previous webinar that I gave a presentation to. And, given that the responses that we got back from the company CEOs and how revealing that was in relation to how their insurance agents responded, I would say that I don't have a whole lot of faith that the insurance agents fully know this space and need a little more education. So I'm not sure that I would bother. But on the other hand, I also have some reluctance that, you want, this is an important thing. You're potentially putting yourself at great monetary risk if there's a crash and you're not covered. And most people are going to be pretty conservative and want to have a very specific answer. So I'm not quite sure. I'm kind of going back and forth on that question myself. But for me, now that I see my company, Allstate, the CEO says it covers, then if I were to volunteer for Red Cross tomorrow, I would probably not bother asking. But I also sent my agent a copy of the paper, so hopefully he knows the answer.
Well, that's good, and that may be a good policy for people to follow as well. Okay.
I remember Helen Kirshner always saying that don't ask for, I forget exactly her words, but don't ask for a problem that doesn't exist, to that effect.
It's probably like lawyers shouldn't ask questions that they don't know the answer to. So we had another question about it's really different. So what are these 10 companies, TNC's policies? Seems like many volunteer drivers are also Lyft and Uber drivers. And did you get into that at all? Because that does add a layer of complexity to this whole thing.
Well, when I spoke with insurance agents, I asked them about their TNC policies, but I didn't actually track them, and they're not, in an organized way in the publication. I would say most of those companies have some form of TNC policy on the books for TNC drivers, but not all. And I was actually somewhat surprised that by 2019, probably when I interviewed them, that they had not done that at that point. There were a couple of companies, and I don't remember which ones they were, who just said, we don't want to be in this business. We're letting other insurance companies pick those policies up.
Okay. So it seems like that's possibly version 2 of your study. Now, how does purchasing excess liability cover volunteer drivers? And that's really something that I think William Henry will deal with in more detail. But I don't know if you want to add anything about that, Jana.
I almost don't want to, because I'm not the insurance expert. I really looked to William Henry's work at SEMA companies for those recommendations, given that they've been endorsed by the National Volunteer Transportation Center, I think NADTC. So I think we should probably reserve that for him. But I believe the way they work is that if a crash occurs, the personal auto insurance policy always is the first to kick in. But if the expenses of that exceed what can be covered under that policy, then I believe that excess liability policy held by the nonprofit would then kick in to further cover the volunteer and anyone injured in the crash.
Yeah, and I think that's an accurate overview of William Henry's presentation. And I can assure folks that we are going to set the date for that very soon. So do stay tuned. It sounds like there might be some interest in that. So next comment is from our friend and my colleague, Carrie Diamond. This report has such positive wide-reaching implications for volunteer driver programs. Thank you for your research, Jana, and for spreading the word about this issue. So,
and thanks back to Carrie Diamond for her patience and bearing with us as it took many, many months to bring this to completion.
Thanks, Carrie. So is there, and this is another question that again, maybe more in William's bailiwick. So is there a suggested list of routine safety protocols? And one of the things I can tell you that I know he talks about is the kinds of rules that govern the volunteer program, that kind of set criteria for how you select volunteers, that set criteria for supervision and communication to ensure that there is a good structure that ensures the high quality of a volunteer transportation program. Jan, I don't know if you have anything to add to that comment.
Well, I know William Henry did he did a training as part of a multi-module training that was provided by NBTC maybe a year or so ago. And just along those lines, he did talk about things like having those protocols in place. Who does the driver call if the passenger gets sick, for instance, and making sure that there's protocols in place that they know that, okay, we're going to check your driving record every year to ensure that there's no decline in your driving skills, that you don't have anything on the record, those types of things. Really trying to minimize risk for everyone. Right. And another thing that I really appreciated that he said in his training was that, nonprofits can use individuals in many ways. So if a driver is determined to no longer be a safe driver, then there's also other opportunities within the services the nonprofit provides to make sure that they have a role and have meaningful work. Because this is as much about providing transportation as it is about, giving people an opportunity to give back to their community, which is so important to people as they age as well.
Thanks. I think that's a really, really important comment, one we shouldn't lose sight of. There's also the issue of people who may not feel safe transporting somebody in their car, but they would be willing to deliver things. Right. And we know that a lot of folks have stepped up in their community who are not the usual drivers in some of these programs. Some young people, for example, folks who are not going to school, but now are in Zoom classes, who are volunteering their time. So really, really, this is such an important community service. There's another question about properly training and educating volunteer drivers. And again, I think that relates more to the work that William's going to talk about. And we won't lose sight of these questions, I can assure you. So do you have advocacy recommendations for organizations at the state or local level on this issue, Jana?
Well, insurance issues is really a state level advocacy type of request. And I would say I'd go back to the recommendations in our report. The biggest one is to try to get laws similar to Maine's adopted so that insurance companies can't just raise insurance rates, et cetera, solely because someone's driving as a volunteer, that they need to base those insurance rate increases on other things, such as the volunteer, because of that service, has greatly increased the miles that they're putting on their car and thus increasing the exposure and potential risk. Not quite sure beyond that what the question is trying to get at in terms of advocacy recommendations, but I could see that, you know, I'm hoping that AARP can even incorporate some of that into its advocacy platform as it goes state offices take up their transportation advocacy platforms in the future. Although, given where I sit in the organization within the Public Policy Institute, I can't, you know, commit any of their resources in order to be able to do that. But if AARP was to take this on as part of its advocacy agenda, I think we would very much want to reach out to organizations that are providing this service, who really have that on-the-ground experience for support and advocacy. If you're able to do that, support and education of state legislators, and really to help provide that human story, examples of volunteers who were faced with insurance issues, because it's those types of stories that make the big difference in advocacy.
So there was a question, and this may be the last one that we have time to take, about using an insurance broker. You know, no, not that question, because that, again, that's more of a William Henry question. But whether or not people should contact their insurance broker about purchasing a policy that is going to cover them as a volunteer driver. Do you know about whether insurance brokers generally are pretty knowledgeable about this, or is this something that's not likely to be an area where they have expertise?
Are you distinguishing between brokers and agents with this question, or?
I don't know.
I kind of lump them as the same, and I would say, you know, I didn't discover any policies that were specific to volunteer driving, and for those agents that were thinking, well, would personal auto policies be covered, you know, they were thinking, well, maybe we need to add a commuter surcharge, or you know, they have different levels without it going to the commercial type of policy. But again, based on the CEO's responses, and these are really the official responses from insurance companies, and given that all who responded unanimously, I have to bet that the insurance industry intends that as long as volunteer driving is an incidental use of the vehicle, that personal auto policies will cover. And so there shouldn't be a need to go and make a request for something special to be a volunteer driver, unless you are intending to put a whole lot more miles on the vehicle, say that, than you would as if you were just commuting to a job.
And I'm going to take the liberty of asking you a final question. Have you all disseminated this report, or are you thinking of disseminating this report to insurance regulators and insurance commissioners in states?
Yes, we did do that.
Excellent.
So
Yeah,
I didn't,
I know in my experience, we've worked with a couple of folks who were trying to create a volunteer driver program and really ran into a barrier with their state insurance commissioner or regulator that
interesting.
really perceived a problem in terms of liability. So anyway,
Yeah.
that's just an anecdote. I don't know how widespread that problem is.
Yeah.
But I'm glad to know that you have disseminated it.
Well, certainly if you have
but-
ideas on how to reach that audience, I mean, sending an email to a list that we've obtained off of the internet is not necessarily the best mechanism to get people's attention. And, you know, I might have received a response from a half a dozen of those individuals from insurance, you know, commissioner offices, but by large, they didn't really respond. So.
We will do an evaluation after the session, and we'll include the opportunity to make additional comments. There are a number of comments still in the chat, and if there are any that are relevant to Jana's report and research, I will be sure to pass those on to her for a response that we can share. But at this point, I would say that I just want to acknowledge Jana's expertise and thank her so much for sharing with us today. I think it's been really, I appreciate the questions that folks have asked. It's been a very enlightening discussion. So Jana, any final words you might want to say?
No, not really. Just thank you so much for having me, and for everyone listening in. Keep doing the great work. I wish you luck, and if I can be of any assistance, just reach out.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much. Have a great afternoon, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.